The streets were alive with the hum of activity as Elijah Moore walked briskly through the crowded neighborhood. His hands clutched a plastic bag filled with groceries, the thin handles biting into his palms. The sun blazed overhead, casting long shadows that danced across the uneven pavement. He weaved carefully through the throng, dodging bicycles and kids chasing after a deflated soccer ball. Elijah's mind was far from the chaos around him. Rent was overdue again, and the landlord had already given a stern warning. His mother, Alicia, had been working herself to the bone at the sewing shop, but it was never enough. Lately, she seemed tired all the time, too tired to hide the worry etched into her face. As he approached a narrow corner, Elijah's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion. Ahead, an elderly man with silver-gray hair was wrestling with a large, worn-out armchair wedged awkwardly in a doorway. The chair's faded blue upholstery looked as though it had seen better days, much like the man struggling to move it. "Damn thing," the old man muttered, beads of sweat rolling down his wrinkled forehead. He pulled at one side of the chair, only for it to stubbornly resist, stuck tight in the narrow frame. Elijah paused. He glanced at the groceries in his hands, then at the man. He knew his mother would be waiting, but something about the man's struggle struck a chord deep in his chest. "Hey, need a hand?" Elijah called out, stepping closer. The old man looked up, startled. For a moment, he squinted at Elijah, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. "You sure, kid? It's heavy." "I'm sure," Elijah replied, setting his bag of groceries carefully on the ground. Together, they worked to maneuver the chair. Elijah braced himself, gripping the coarse fabric tightly as he helped push it through the doorframe. His muscles burned, and his fingers ached, but eventually, the chair slid into the cramped living room with a satisfying thud. The old man leaned against the wall, panting heavily. "Thank you, boy," he said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "Not many kids would stop to help these days." "It's no big deal," Elijah said, shrugging off the compliment. The man pulled out a crumpled $10 bill from his pocket and extended it toward Elijah. "Here, take this. It's not much, but it's something." Elijah shook his head, stepping back. "No, sir. I didn't do it for money." The old man frowned but didn't push further. Instead, he gave Elijah a grateful smile. "Well, thank you. Truly. My name's Mr. Harris. You ever need anything, you know where to find me." Elijah picked up his groceries and nodded politely. "Have a good day, Mr. Harris." As he walked away, the tension in his shoulders eased a little. Helping the old man hadn't solved his own problems, but it felt good to do something right. The world might not always be fair, but moments like these reminded Elijah that kindness still mattered. When he reached home, his mother was at the small kitchen table, surrounded by a mountain of fabric scraps and thread. She glanced up when Elijah entered, her face softening for just a moment before her eyes flickered to the empty bag in his hands. "You sold everything?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope. "Yeah," Elijah replied, setting the bag on the counter. Alicia let out a relieved sigh. "Good. At least we'll have something for groceries tomorrow." Her voice faltered as she glanced at the pile of unopened bills on the table. "We'll figure it out, Mom," Elijah said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. She gave him a small, tired smile. "I hope you're right." That night, Elijah lay on his thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling. The weight of their situation pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He thought about Mr. Harris and his gratitude. He thought about his mother's exhaustion. Most of all, he thought about the landlord's threats. He didn't know how they were going to make it through the month, but deep down, he held on to a faint glimmer of hope. What Elijah didn't realize was that his simple act of kindness had set something in motion. The next day would bring unexpected changes, ones that would challenge everything he thought he knew about fairness, justice, and the power of doing the right thing. The morning sun bathed the neighborhood in a pale golden light, though the warmth did little to ease the tension in Elijah's home. His mother, Alicia, moved quietly around the kitchen, her movements deliberate but weary. The stack of bills on the table remained untouched, an ever-present reminder of their struggles. Elijah sat by the window, eating a piece of dry bread for breakfast, when a noise outside caught his attention. The unmistakable hum of a powerful engine rumbled through the street. He turned his head just in time to see a sleek, black luxury car gliding down the road. Its polished exterior gleamed in the sunlight, standing out sharply against the rusted vehicles parked along the curb. "What in the world?" Alicia muttered, peeking out the window as well. The car came to a slow stop directly in front of their small, weathered house. Curious faces appeared in windows up and down the street as neighbors tried to catch a glimpse of whoever could afford such a vehicle in a place like this. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in a sharp gray suit stepped out. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he adjusted his cufflinks, surveying his surroundings with calm authority. "Do you know him?" Alicia asked, her voice tight with suspicion. "No," Elijah said, shaking his head. Before they could speculate further, the man walked up the short path to their front door and knocked. Alicia hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Finally, she opened it just enough to peek out. "Good morning," the man said, his tone polite but confident. "I'm Malcolm Harris. Is this the Moore residence?" "Yes," Alicia replied cautiously. "What do you need?" Malcolm glanced at Elijah, who was now standing just behind his mother. A faint smile crossed his face. "I believe you're the young man who helped my father yesterday. He couldn't stop talking about it when I visited him last night." Elijah blinked in surprise. "Your father?" "Mr. Harris," Malcolm clarified. "The one with the chair. That was my father." Elijah nodded slowly. "Yeah, I helped him out." "Well," Malcolm said, "he wanted me to come by and express our gratitude. Not many people would go out of their way to help a stranger like that, especially without expecting anything in return." "It wasn't a big deal," Elijah said, feeling a little awkward under Malcolm's gaze. "It was to him," Malcolm replied, "and to me." He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. "This is for you and your family. Consider it a small token of appreciation." Alicia's eyes narrowed as she looked at the envelope. "We don't take handouts," she said firmly, her voice sharp. Malcolm held up a hand. "I understand your pride, ma'am, and I respect it. But this isn't charity. My father needs a bit of help around the house. If Elijah is interested, we'd like to offer him a part-time job. It's honest work, and he'll be fairly compensated." Elijah looked at his mother, who still appeared wary. "What kind of work?" Alicia asked, crossing her arms. "Light tasks," Malcolm explained. "Carrying boxes, organizing items, and keeping my father company from time to time. Nothing too demanding. It's flexible, so it won't interfere with school." Alicia hesitated, glancing at Elijah. Her protective instincts told her to refuse, but the thought of steady income, even a small amount, was hard to ignore. Finally, she sighed. "We'll think about it," she said. Malcolm nodded, slipping the envelope back into his pocket. "Take your time. If you decide to move forward, give me a call." He handed Alicia a sleek business card. "It has my number. My father speaks highly of your son, and I'd like to do something that benefits everyone involved." Elijah watched as Malcolm returned to his car, his footsteps measured and confident. The car roared to life and disappeared down the street, leaving the neighbors to murmur and speculate behind their curtains. Inside the house, the tension was palpable. Alicia turned to Elijah, her expression conflicted. "What do you think?" Elijah asked, his voice tentative. "I think people like that don't do things out of the kindness of their hearts," Alicia said, placing the business card on the table. "There's always something else behind it." Elijah nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. Malcolm had seemed sincere, and Mr. Harris didn't strike him as the type to manipulate anyone. Still, his mother's words echoed in his mind. As they sat back down, the envelope and the business card remained untouched on the table, a silent reminder of the decision they had to make. Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that this opportunity, whether a blessing or a trap, might be the first step toward changing their lives. And change, he thought, was something they desperately needed. Elijah stood outside the Harris home, clutching the straps of his worn backpack. The house was small but well kept, a stark contrast to the dilapidated homes in his own neighborhood. Its brick walls gleamed in the sunlight, and the front lawn was trimmed to near perfection. The sight filled him with a mix of curiosity and unease. After a hesitant knock, The door swung open to reveal Mr. Harris, a warm smile lighting up his weathered face. "There's my helper," Mr. Harris said, his voice a bit hoarse but welcoming. "Come in, boy. Come in." Elijah stepped inside, his sneakers making barely a sound on the polished wooden floors. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old books, an odd but comforting combination. "Glad you decided to take the job," Mr. Harris said, leading him to a cozy sitting room. "Malcolm's been after me to get some help for months, but I wasn't sure anyone would bother. People around here are too busy with their own problems." Elijah offered a polite smile, though he could sense a loneliness in the man's words. "What do you need me to do today, sir?" "Just some organizing," Mr. Harris replied, gesturing toward a hallway. "The attic is full of old boxes. I can't climb the ladder anymore, and Malcolm's too busy to help. Think you can handle it?" Elijah nodded. Of course. The attic was stuffy and dimly lit, with beams of sunlight filtering through a small, dusty window. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, their labels faded and unreadable. Elijah climbed the narrow ladder carefully, then began the slow work of sorting through the clutter. As he worked, he uncovered fragments of Mr. Harris's life. A stack of black and white photographs, a medal from a war-long past, and a leather-bound journal that smelled faintly of cedar. Each item told a story, and though Elijah didn't dare pry too deeply, he couldn't help but feel a growing respect for the man who had lived through so much. "Find anything interesting?" Mr. Harris called from below. "A lot of memories," Elijah replied, carrying a box down the ladder. Mr. Harris chuckled. "That's one way to put it. My wife used to say I was a hoarder, but I prefer to think of it as preserving history." They spent the afternoon sorting through the boxes, sharing stories, and the occasional laugh. Mr. Harris's voice grew livelier as he reminisced about his late wife and their adventures. Elijah listened intently, finding himself drawn to the man's warmth and wit. For a moment, the weight of his own troubles seemed to lift. When Malcolm arrived that evening, his entrance was as precise and deliberate as everything else about him. He surveyed the room with a faint smile, his gaze landing on the neatly stacked boxes. "You've been busy," Malcolm said, nodding in approval. "Elijah's a hard worker," Mr. Harris said proudly. "Did more in a day than I could have done in a week." Elijah felt his cheeks flush. It wasn't that hard. Malcolm handed Elijah an envelope, his expression unreadable. "Here's your pay for the day. You earned it." Elijah hesitated before taking the envelope, feeling its unfamiliar weight in his hand. "Thank you." Malcolm's eyes softened slightly. "You're helping my father, but you're helping yourself too. Don't forget that." When Elijah returned home that night, his mother was waiting for him in the kitchen. She looked up from the pile of fabric she was sewing, her eyes widening slightly when she saw the envelope in his hand. "How was it?" she asked, her voice cautious. "It was good," Elijah said, setting the envelope on the table. "Mr. Harris is a nice guy. He just needed some help with his attic." Alicia stared at the envelope for a long moment before picking it up. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it and pulled out the bills inside. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's more than I thought," she murmured, her voice wavering. Elijah nodded. "They said I can come back. After school and on weekends." For the first time in weeks, Alicia smiled. A real, genuine smile that lit up her tired face. "I'm proud of you, Elijah. You're doing so much for us." Elijah shrugged, though his chest swelled with a mix of pride and relief. "We're in this together, Mom. Always." As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Elijah felt a faint flicker of hope. The money wasn't enough to solve all their problems, but it was a start. Still, a question lingered in the back of his mind. Why had Malcolm and Mr. Harris been so eager to help him? Something about it didn't add up, but for now, Elijah was content to focus on the good. Whatever the answer was, he would face it when the time came. The week passed in a blur as Elijah balanced school, chores, and his new job. Mr. Harris kept him busy with small tasks, cleaning out closets, fixing squeaky hinges, and reorganizing dusty shelves. The work was straightforward, but Elijah didn't mind. He appreciated the quiet companionship of the older man and the stories that flowed easily between them. But as Elijah's days grew brighter, the shadows at home deepened. The landlord, Victor Grant, was becoming increasingly aggressive. His latest visit had left Alicia shaken, her hands trembling as she stitched fabric late into the night. He said, "We're out of chances," Alicia told Elijah over a meager dinner of rice and beans. Her voice was tight, strained. "If we don't have the money by Friday, he's kicking us out." Elijah clenched his fists under the table. "He can't just throw us out like that." "He can," Alicia said, her eyes darting to the stack of unpaid bills. "And he will." The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Elijah's mind raced. The money he was earning from Mr. Harris was helpful, but it wasn't enough to cover what they owed. "We'll figure something out," Elijah said finally, his voice firm. His mother gave him a small, tired smile, but the fear in her eyes remained. The next day, Elijah returned to the Harris house after school, his thoughts heavy with worry. As he worked in the garden, Malcolm arrived, stepping out of his sleek car with his usual composed air. "Elijah," Malcolm called, walking toward him. Elijah stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Hey." Malcolm studied him for a moment. "You look like you've got something on your mind." "It's nothing," Elijah said quickly. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Elijah hesitated. There was something about Malcolm's calm demeanor that made him want to talk, even if he wasn't sure he should. "It's just things are bad at home," Elijah admitted, his voice low. "The landlord's threatening to evict us if we don't pay what we owe by Friday." Malcolm frowned, his jaw tightening. "Victor Grant?" Elijah nodded. "You know him?" Malcolm's expression darkened. "Unfortunately, yes. He's a parasite. Preys on people who can't fight back." Elijah felt a flicker of hope. "Is there anything we can do?" "There's always something that can be done," Malcolm said, his tone measured. "But it's not without risk. People like Grant don't give up their power easily." Elijah nodded slowly, his resolve hardening. "I'm not afraid of him." Malcolm's gaze softened. "You should be, Elijah. But fear doesn't mean you back down. It means you think carefully about your next move." That evening, Malcolm visited Alicia. He stood in the cramped living room, his presence commanding but not imposing. "Mrs. Moore," he said respectfully, "I understand that Victor Grant has been giving you trouble. I'd like to help." Alicia crossed her arms, her expression wary. "We don't need charity." "This isn't charity," Malcolm replied evenly. "It's about holding people like Grant accountable. He's been exploiting families like yours for years, and it's time someone put a stop to it." Alicia shook her head. "And what happens if he comes after us? I have a son to protect. I can't afford to make enemies." "I understand your fear," Malcolm said, his voice gentle, "but staying silent only lets him continue hurting others. If we work together, we can expose him. I have the resources to make sure he can't touch you or your son." Elijah, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "Mom, we can't keep letting people like him push us around. We have to do something." Alicia's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her son. "You don't understand, Elijah. Fighting back isn't always the answer. Sometimes it makes things worse." Elijah's voice softened. "But if we don't fight, nothing will ever change." The room was heavy with unspoken fears, but after a long silence, Alicia nodded. "Okay, but only if you promise me we'll be careful." The plan unfolded over the next few days. Malcolm and Elijah worked together to gather evidence against Victor Grant. Malcolm's network of connections proved invaluable, uncovering records of illegal rent hikes, forged eviction notices, and bribes paid to local officials. Meanwhile, Elijah went door to door in his neighborhood, speaking to other tenants who had suffered under Grant's exploitation. At first, people were hesitant to talk, but Elijah's determination won them over. Slowly, the community began to rally together, their shared anger fueling a collective resolve. But as the momentum built, so did the danger. One evening, as Elijah walked home from the Harris house, a black car pulled up beside him. The tinted window rolled down, revealing a man with cold, calculating eyes. "You're poking your nose where it doesn't belong, kid," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "Best you leave this alone, or you and your mom will regret it." Elijah's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. "I'm not scared of you," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. The man smirked. You should be. The car sped off, leaving Elijah shaken but more determined than ever. He refused to let fear win. By the end of the week, the evidence was ready, and the tenants were united. Malcolm had arranged for a lawyer to file a case against Victor Grant, and a local journalist had agreed to cover the story. As Alicia watched the events unfold, her fear began to give way to a fragile hope. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that justice might be within reach. But Elijah knew the fight was far from over. They had taken the first step, but the road ahead would be long and treacherous. Still, as he looked at his mother's faint smile and the resolve in the faces of his neighbors, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of power. For the first time, it felt like they had a chance to win. The morning after the confrontation with the man in the black car, Elijah awoke to the sound of voices outside his window. He pushed back the thin curtain and saw his neighbors gathered in small clusters, murmuring in hushed tones. A patrol car was parked near the corner, its blue lights flashing faintly in the daylight. "What's going on?" Elijah muttered to himself as he quickly dressed and stepped outside. He spotted Mrs. Greaves, an elderly tenant who lived 2 doors down, clutching a faded shawl around her shoulders. "What happened?" Elijah asked. "They evicted the Thompsons last night," she said, her voice trembling. "Just threw them out. No warning, no nothing." Elijah's chest tightened. The Thompsons were a family of 5, struggling like everyone else in the neighborhood. They had been one of the first to join the effort against Victor Grant. Did anyone help them? Elijah asked, anger creeping into his voice. Mrs. Greaves shook her head. "They came with 2 men, middle of the night. The Thompsons didn't stand a chance." Elijah clenched his fists, his mind racing. The message was clear. Victor Grant wasn't just threatening them. He was escalating. When Elijah arrived at the Harris house later that day, Malcolm was already there, pacing the living room with a phone pressed to his ear. His usual calm demeanor had cracked, revealing a sharp edge of frustration. "Absolutely not," Malcolm said into the phone. "We're not backing down. If anything, this proves we're getting to him." He ended the call abruptly, tossing his phone onto the coffee table. "Victor's making moves," he said, turning to Elijah. "The Thompsons were evicted last night. He's trying to scare the rest of the tenants into silence." "It's working," Elijah said bitterly. "People are terrified." "That's how men like him operate," Malcolm said. "Fear is their greatest weapon, but it only works if you let it." Elijah frowned. "So what do we do? Just keep going like nothing happened?" "We adapt," Malcolm replied, his voice firm. "We double down. The evidence we have is enough to start the legal process, but we need the tenants to stay united. If they scatter now, Grant wins." Elijah nodded, though his stomach churned at the thought of facing more retaliation. The next few days were grueling. Elijah went door to door again, talking to neighbors who were beginning to waver. Some were resolute, but others had already packed their belongings, preparing to leave before Grant could target them. "You don't understand," one woman told Elijah, her voice trembling. "I have 2 kids. I can't risk them being out on the street. I have to go." Elijah tried to argue, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. As she closed the door, he felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. That evening, as he walked home, Elijah found himself questioning everything. Was it worth the risk? Could they really beat someone like Victor Grant? The fight suddenly felt too big, too impossible. When he arrived home, Alicia was waiting for him at the kitchen table. She had been sewing again, but her hands were still, and her face was pale. "Another letter came today," she said quietly, sliding an envelope across the table. Elijah opened it, his heart sinking as he read the words. It was an official eviction notice. They had 7 days. "This isn't fair," Elijah said, his voice trembling with anger. "No," Alicia agreed, her voice weary, "but life rarely is." Elijah looked at his mother, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes. She had always carried their burdens with quiet strength, but this was breaking her. "We can't let him win, Mom," Elijah said softly. Alicia reached across the table, resting a hand on his. "I know you want to fight, Elijah, and I'm proud of you for that. But sometimes, fighting comes at a cost we can't afford." Elijah shook his head. "If we don't stand up now, He'll just keep doing this to other families. Someone has to stop him. Alicia didn't respond, but the worry in her eyes spoke volumes. The next day, Malcolm arrived with news. The journalist agreed to publish the story, he said, handing Elijah a printed draft of the article. The headline read, "Landlord exploits vulnerable tenants. A community fights back." Elijah scanned the article, his chest tightening as he read the details. The journalist had included testimony from several tenants, along with the evidence Malcolm had gathered. It was damning, but it also painted a target on everyone involved. "This is going to push him over the edge," Elijah said. "Probably," Malcolm admitted, "but it also puts the spotlight on him. The more attention we draw, the harder it'll be for him to act without consequences." Elijah nodded, though a knot of anxiety twisted in his stomach. That night, as he lay in bed, Elijah thought about the Thompsons, his neighbors, and his mother. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a heavy stone. But then he thought about Mr. Harris and the stories he'd shared. Stories of standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. Elijah clenched his fists, a spark of determination igniting within him. He couldn't control what Victor Grant did, but he could control how he responded. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. By morning, the article had gone live, and the impact was immediate. Phones buzzed, neighbors whispered, and Victor Grant's name was suddenly the subject of public scrutiny. The journalist's piece had painted him as a villain, exposing years of illegal evictions, fraudulent leases, and harassment of low-income families. For Elijah, it was a victory, but a small one. The real fight was just beginning. Elijah sat at the Harris dining table, a stack of printed documents spread before him. Malcolm stood nearby, pacing as he spoke into his phone, while Mr. Harris sipped tea in the corner, his eyes fixed on Elijah with quiet encouragement. "This is solid," Malcolm said, hanging up. "The tenants' testimonies, the financial records, the photographs of those fake eviction notices. It's enough to build a case." Elijah nodded, though his nerves were frayed. "And what happens now?" "Now, we submit this to the courts," Malcolm said, sitting across from him. "But it'll take time. Meanwhile, Grant isn't going to sit quietly. We have to prepare for his next move." Elijah swallowed hard. He knew Malcolm was right. The stakes were higher now, and Grant wouldn't back down easily. As expected, Grant struck back swiftly. The very next day, men in dark suits began patrolling the neighborhood. They lingered by doorsteps, spoke in hushed tones to tenants, and slipped threatening letters under doors. The message was clear: stay silent or suffer the consequences. Elijah watched one of them from his window, his fists clenching in anger. "They're trying to scare us," he said aloud. "They're succeeding," Alicia said from behind him, her voice tight with fear. "People are already backing out. I heard Mrs. Greaves packed up this morning." Elijah turned to face her, his eyes blazing. "We can't let them win, Mom." Alicia's face softened. "I admire your courage, Elijah, but this is dangerous. These men aren't playing games." Elijah nodded. "I know, but if we back down now, everything we've done will be for nothing." Malcolm called a meeting at Mr. Harris's house that evening, inviting the remaining tenants who hadn't yet been scared off. A dozen people crammed into the small living room, their faces tense but determined. "Victor Grant is scared," Malcolm began, his voice calm but firm. "The article has exposed him, and he knows the law is closing in. But he's counting on fear to break our momentum. Don't let him." A tenant in the back raised her hand. "But what if he comes after us directly? What can we do then?" Malcolm nodded. "We document everything. Every threat, every visit, every letter. We'll share it with the press, the police, and the courts. The more light we shine on his tactics, the less power he has." Elijah stood, his voice steady. "This isn't just about us anymore. If we win, it'll show people like Grant that they can't keep exploiting people like this. We have to stand together." The room was silent for a moment, then Mr. Harris spoke up from his chair. "He's right. I've lived a long life, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that change doesn't come easy. But it's worth fighting for." The tension in the room eased slightly, and a few people nodded in agreement. Slowly, the tenants began to voice their support. Over the next few days, the fight intensified. Malcolm worked tirelessly to secure legal backing, while Elijah continued rallying his neighbors, convincing them to hold the line. The tenants' courage wavered at times, but Elijah's determination was unwavering, his belief in their cause infecting those around him. But the danger also grew. One evening, as Elijah walked home, he noticed a shadow trailing him. He quickened his pace, but the shadow matched him step for step. "Hey, kid," a gruff voice called. Elijah turned to see one of Grant's men, tall and broad-shouldered, leaning against a street lamp. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," the man said, his tone almost mocking. "But you're biting off more than you can chew. Walk away while you still can." Elijah's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. "Not a chance." The man smirked. "Suit yourself. Don't say I didn't warn you." As the man walked away, Elijah's hands trembled, but his resolve only grew stronger. That weekend, Malcolm revealed the next phase of the plan. "We've secured a hearing," he announced to Elijah and Alicia. "The courts have agreed to look at the evidence. If they side with us, Grant could lose his properties and face criminal charges." Elijah's heart soared. "When's the hearing?" "2 weeks," Malcolm said. "But it's going to be a battle. Grant will do everything in his power to discredit us." "We're ready," Elijah said, his voice firm. Malcolm smiled faintly. "I believe you are." That night, as Elijah lay in bed, he thought about how far they had come. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of his mind, but so was hope. For the first time in his life, it felt like they had a chance, not just to survive, but to win. He whispered into the quiet darkness, "We can do this." And for the first time, he truly believed it. The courthouse loomed large, its stone facade stark against the gray morning sky. A small crowd had gathered outside, a mix of reporters, community members, and curious onlookers. Elijah tightened his grip on his mother's hand as they approached the building. "Are you sure about this?" Alicia asked, her voice trembling. Elijah nodded. "We've come too far to back out now." Malcolm met them at the courthouse steps, his expression as sharp as his tailored suit. "You ready?" he asked Elijah. "As ready as I'll ever be," Elijah replied. The doors opened, and the group filed inside. The courtroom was a solemn space, the air heavy with anticipation. Victor Grant sat at the defendant's table, his expensive lawyer by his side. Grant's smug expression faltered when he saw the tenants filling the benches behind Elijah. They weren't alone. The hearing began with the judge calling the room to order. Malcolm stood confidently, presenting the tenants' case with precision and evidence. He outlined years of illegal evictions, forged documents, and harassment tactics, backed by testimonies from the tenants. Elijah watched as one neighbor after another took the stand. Their voices trembled at first, but as they recounted their experiences, the fear gave way to anger and resolve. When it was Elijah's turn, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. "State your name for the record," the judge said. "Elijah Moore." Malcolm approached him with a kind smile. "Elijah, can you tell the court how Victor Grant's actions have affected you and your family?" Elijah nodded, his voice steady. "He's threatened to evict us more times than I can count. My mom works every day, but no matter how much we pay, it's never enough. He keeps raising the rent, and if we complain, he sends people to scare us." "Has this affected your schooling?" Malcolm asked. "Yes," Elijah replied. "It's hard to focus when you don't know if you'll have a home to go back to." As Elijah spoke, he felt the weight of the courtroom pressing down on him, but he kept going, pouring out every injustice he and his neighbors had endured. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Grant's lawyer tried to discredit the tenants, painting them as unreliable and suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial. But Malcolm was prepared. He countered every argument with cold, hard facts, slowly dismantling Grant's defense. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as Malcolm delivered his closing statement. "This case isn't just about one landlord," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "It's about a system that allows people like Victor Grant to exploit the vulnerable without consequence. My clients are not asking for charity. They are asking for justice. And today, Your Honor, we have the power to give them that." The judge called for a recess, leaving the courtroom buzzing with nervous energy. Elijah and Alicia sat quietly, their hands intertwined. "What happens if we lose?" Alicia whispered. "We won't," Elijah said, though his voice lacked conviction. After what felt like an eternity, the judge returned. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimonies, it is clear that Mr. Grant has engaged in a pattern of illegal and unethical practices. The court finds in favor of the plaintiffs." Cheers erupted from the tenants, tears streaming down faces as years of fear and frustration gave way to relief. Grant's smug expression had disappeared, replaced with a tight-lipped scowl. The judge's ruling included heavy fines, the return of stolen funds, and an injunction to prevent further evictions until the properties were reviewed by housing authorities. Elijah turned to his mother, who was crying quietly. He hugged her tightly, his own tears threatening to spill. "We did it, Mom," he whispered. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was waiting. Reporters clamored for interviews, but Elijah's focus was on the neighbors who had stood with him. "You were incredible," Malcolm said, clapping him on the shoulder. "I couldn't have done it without everyone," Elijah replied, his voice filled with gratitude. Mr. Harris approached, leaning on his cane. "You've got the heart of a fighter, Elijah. You remind me of myself when I was young." Elijah smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Harris, for everything." As the sun set that evening, Elijah sat with his mother on the front steps of their house. The fight was over, but the work wasn't done. The neighborhood had changed, not physically, but in spirit. People were talking about organizing, about demanding better treatment from those in power. For the first time, Elijah felt a sense of pride, not just for what they had achieved, but for what they had started. "We're going to be okay," he said, squeezing his mother's hand. Alicia smiled, her eyes soft with hope. "Yes, we are." The weeks that followed the court ruling were a whirlwind for Elijah and his family. Victor Grant's defeat had sent shockwaves through the community, and the neighborhood began to change in ways no one had imagined. The tenants, emboldened by their victory, came together to form a tenant association. Meetings were held in living rooms and community centers, where people shared ideas and resources to ensure they'd never be exploited again. Elijah found himself at the center of these efforts, his voice carrying weight among the people who had once been too afraid to speak. One crisp autumn morning, Elijah stood outside his house, staring at the street that had once felt so hopeless. A familiar car pulled up, its sleek black frame gleaming in the sunlight. Malcolm stepped out, his expression warm but businesslike. "Busy day ahead?" he asked. "Always," Elijah replied with a grin. "I wanted to let you know," Malcolm said, leaning casually against the car. "Victor Grant won't be bothering anyone again. His properties are under government oversight, and the fines have wiped out most of his fortune." Elijah nodded, satisfaction swelling in his chest. "Good. He deserves it." Malcolm's gaze softened. "You did something incredible, Elijah. You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for everyone here. That's rare." "Maybe," Elijah said, looking down. "I just couldn't stand by anymore. It didn't feel right." "That's what makes you different," Malcolm said, "and why people believe in you." Before Elijah could respond, Mr. Harris appeared in the doorway, his cane tapping lightly against the steps. "Malcolm, stop hogging the boy. I want to talk to him too," Mr. Harris said with a wry smile. Malcolm chuckled. "I'll leave you to it." As Malcolm returned to his car, Mr. Harris motioned for Elijah to sit with him on the porch. "You've come a long way, kid," Mr. Harris said, his voice warm with pride. "I couldn't have done it without you," Elijah replied. Mr. Harris chuckled softly. "You give me too much credit. All I did was give you a nudge. The rest was all you." Elijah glanced at the man who had become a mentor to him, his eyes shining with gratitude. "You didn't have to help me, Mr. Harris, but you did, and that made all the difference." "Well," Mr. Harris said, leaning back in his chair, "I saw a spark in you, something I hadn't seen in a long time. I wasn't about to let it go to waste." Later that evening, Elijah and his mother sat together at the kitchen table. The pile of unpaid bills that once dominated the space was gone, replaced by a small vase of fresh flowers. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Elijah asked. Alicia looked at him, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Lighter," she said, "like I can finally breathe again." "You've done so much for us, Elijah." I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You don't have to, Elijah said gently. We're a team, remember? Alicia smiled, tears welling in her eyes. Always. The next Saturday, the neighborhood gathered in the small park at the center of the community. Tables were set up with food, children played games, and music filled the air. It was a celebration, not just of their victory, but of their newfound unity. Elijah stood at the edge of the park, taking it all in. He thought about how far they had come, from fear and despair to hope and resilience. Malcolm approached him, holding a plate of food. Big turnout, he said, nodding toward the crowd. Yeah, Elijah said with a smile. It feels good. Malcolm studied him for a moment. What's next for you, Elijah? College? Politics? Elijah laughed. One thing at a time, Malcolm. But I do know I want to keep helping people. There's a lot more to fix, and I want to be part of it. Malcolm smiled, his respect for the boy evident. I have no doubt you will. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah stood with his mother, watching the lights of the celebration twinkle against the darkening sky. We did it, Alicia said softly. Elijah nodded. Yeah, we did. For the first time in years, their future felt bright, not just for them, but for the entire neighborhood. Because justice wasn't just something they fought for. It was something they created together.